The only sound cutting through the oppressive, moonless night was the strained, metallic groan of a sewing machine, muffled beneath 3 thick wool blankets. Outside, the air was a chill, damp blanket, perfectly still, undisturbed by wind. A good sign. Inside the small, cramped attic of the Strelzik family home, Peter Strelzik, a stocky, 37-year-old electrician and former Air Force mechanic, sweated. His brow was furrowed with a concentration that bordered on terror, his movements precise and economical. His wife, Doris, sat opposite him, her hands steadying the massive, cumbersome swath of material feeding into the needle. It wasn't a quilt or a shirt they were working on. It was a shroud, a sail, a fragile, improbable ticket to freedom, the fabric of a hot air balloon. For Peter, the wall wasn't just a 12-foot concrete barrier 150 miles away in Berlin. It was the Staatssicherheit, the omnipresent Stasi, the cold, suffocating system that had cornered him. His little town of Posneck, nestled in the Thuringian district, felt like the bottom of a well. He worked a decent job, but every application he made, for a telephone line, for a better apartment, for a simple permit to visit the West for a family funeral, was rubber-stamped with a hard, flattening. The GDR had been built on a lie of paradise, but all he saw was a prison built of bureaucracy and barbed wire. This wasn't his first attempt. 6 months earlier, Peter and his close friend, Gunter Wetzel, a 24-year-old bricklayer and electrician, had conceived the idea during a late-night radio session listening to the forbidden music of the West. They initially tried a small, circular test balloon made from thin nylon taffeta. Peter, the engineer, had built a makeshift propane burner system from an old gas bottle and an improvised nozzle. On a cold March night, they drove to a secluded forest clearing, inflated their fragile creation, and let it go with a small, battery-operated transmitter and a doll inside. The balloon soared, magnificent and silent, into the darkness. But their first triumph was short-lived. The next day, the Stasi found the remnants of the balloon near the border zone. The escape attempt failed, but the materials they used were common enough that the secret police didn't connect it to them. They were lucky. This near miss didn't deter Peter. It amplified the danger and narrowed the window. They now knew the balloon had to be bigger, the fabric tougher, the burner stronger, and most critically, they needed to bring both their families. The Strelziks, Peter, Doris, and their 2 sons, Frank, 15, and Andreas, 11. And the Wetzels, Gunter, his wife Petra, and their 2 young children, were 8 people in total. The initial taffeta balloon couldn't possibly carry that weight. Now, their attic was a clandestine workshop. They'd spent weeks hoarding materials, a desperate, subtle game of procurement against the watchful eyes of their neighbors and the state. The main body of a new balloon was a massive, checkerboard quilt of fabrics, scraps of bright, striped tent canvas mixed with hundreds of square feet of ordinary cotton bedsheets bought from department stores across multiple cities to avoid suspicion. The material was cheap, porous, and extremely heavy, but it was all they could get. They dyed the bedsheets a dull, deep brown in their bathtub, using kilograms of store-bought fabric dye to prevent the brilliant white from being spotted by border guard searchlights. The machine groaned again. Each stitch had to be perfect. Peter wasn't just sewing 2 pieces of cloth. He was stitching together the difference between a new life and a lifetime of imprisonment in the notorious Botzen prison. He knew the Stasi had a special wing reserved for Republik Flucht, flight from the Republic. The penalty for 2 families attempting to cross the fortified inner German border was not just time, but a guaranteed separation from their children. Doris leaned in, her voice a low, fierce whisper. "We're running out of thread, Peter. Are you sure this batch is strong enough for the top seams?" The thread itself was a gamble, polyester thread bought under the guise of starting a small garment repair business. The sheer scale of the sewing, nearly 1,200 square yards of fabric, had worn their consumer-grade sewing machine to the bone. Every pull of the needle was a risk of failure, a risk of the noise being heard. They worked in 4-hour shifts, stopping just before dawn when the factory shifts began, and normal street sound might have covered their work. They had to hurry. Summer was fading, and the colder, clearer air of autumn was the ideal thermal condition for flight. But winter would bring stronger, more unpredictable winds. Their deadline was self-imposed and absolute: the next 2 weeks. Gunter was busy in his garage, preparing the basket and the burner, the engineering heart of the impossible escape. Meanwhile, across Posneck, Gunter Wetzel was immersed in his own silent, highly technical terror. Gunter, the younger man, the pragmatic bricklayer, was the designated basket and burner specialist. His garage, like Peter's attic, was a theater of clandestine improvisation. The biggest challenge wasn't just lifting 8 people. It was sustaining that lift without sophisticated, specialized equipment. Gunter's eyes, usually bright with youthful energy, were red-rimmed from sleepless nights spent poring over borrowed, outdated physics textbooks and manuals on thermodynamics. He was attempting to build a system of propulsion, a burner that had to produce an enormous, continuous column of heat from readily available resources without making an explosion. The fuel source was easy: liquid propane, commonly used for cooking and heating. He had acquired 4 large, standard residential propane cylinders. The true difficulty was the nozzle and combustion chamber. In the West, burners were made of specialized, heat-resistant steel and aluminum alloys. Gunter's workshop yielded something far more desperate: a combustion chamber fashioned from 2 used steel oil barrels, the kind used for industrial waste, welded end-to-end, stripped of their internal residues, and painstakingly modified. He engineered the mixing chamber with a series of crude, reinforced steel pipes salvaged from scrapyard, creating a large, circular ring at the bottom of the balloon's mouth. This ring was where the propane would be injected and ignited. The main burner nozzle itself was a marvel of resourceful engineering: a custom-fitted piece of fire extinguisher nozzle, thick, brass, and capable of handling high pressure. He hammered, welded, and filed the components, his hands rough and scarred, relying purely on mechanical intuition. The burner test was the most dangerous part of the whole enterprise, a moment they had both dreaded. They couldn't simply fire it up in Posneck. The roar of the forced air combustion would be heard for blocks, and the towering flame would be visible above the rooftops. Instead, Gunter devised a silent test for the fuel delivery system. He filled the cylinders, ran the copper piping, and tested the connections with soapy water to check for leaks, watching for the telltale bubbles that would mean a catastrophic failure, a leak that could turn their basket into a fireball. The pressures were immense. A failure here meant not just being caught, but being incinerated. Parallel to the burner, the gondola, the basket that would carry the 2 families, was taking shape. They couldn't use a heavy wicker basket like Westerners because of the excessive weight. The solution was sheer practicality: a rectangular 4.5 foot by 4.5 foot steel frame, incredibly light but deceptively sturdy, welded together by Gunter from thin steel angle iron. The floor was thin plywood board, and the walls were simply rope netting strung around the frame. It was designed to be a lightweight cage for 8 people, nothing more than a platform to keep them from falling out. "It looks like a giant metal playpen," Petra Wetzel commented one afternoon, watching Gunter secure the final corner with a desperate weld. Her voice held a tremble. Petra was younger than Doris, more nervous, but she possessed a quiet strength born of absolute loyalty to Gunter. She knew, as they all did, that the basket represented the point of no return. Once they climbed into this cage, their fate would be sealed, either on the ground in a Stasi cell or 6,000 feet up in the cold, indifferent sky. The 2 families were now interwoven, bound by fabric and steel, silence and terror. They had established a system of communication based on mundane household items. A small, specific arrangement of curtains in a certain window meant, "It is safe, continue working." A specific plant pot on the porch meant, "Danger, stop all activity." This silent language was their only defense against the neighbors, the party members, the casual informants who were the eyes and ears of the Stasi. As the balloon's 12-foot-tall panels were finally stitched together in Peter's attic, they realized the sheer size of their creation. It was a giant, ugly, brown-striped onion, nearly 85 feet tall when fully inflated, far larger than the 2-story house that contained it. Moving this massive, unwieldy canopy from the attic to the outside without being seen would be an operation almost as complex and dangerous as the flight itself. They had to wait for the perfect storm, a quiet early Sunday morning when most neighbors would be sleeping, a forecast of low wind, and, most crucially, a new moon, absolute darkness. Their last practice drill was grimly realistic. They timed how long it took to extinguish the burner and how quickly they could hide the equipment. They practiced pulling the 4 young children, who were constantly asking questions, into the small, confined space of the basket frame. Every contingency, except for the unpredictable forces of wind and fate, was meticulously planned. The date was set, a dark night in the last week of September. September 17th, 1979. A clearing near Oberlemnitz, East Germany. 1:15 a.m. The night felt like a velvet trap. The families drove their 2 small Wartburg cars in a convoy, the massive bundle of fabric disguised under blankets and tarps in Peter's trunk. The Wetzels followed with the steel basket and propane cylinders strapped precariously to their roof. Their destination was a small, secluded forest clearing close to the town of Oberlemnitz, chosen because it was just outside the immediate, heavily restricted 5-kilometer border zone, yet close enough that a successful flight would put them over the border quickly. The drive was agonizing. Every oncoming headlight, every distant sound of a barking dog sent a jolt of ice water through Peter's veins. Frank and Andreas, Peter's sons, sat tense and silent, knowing instinctively the gravity of the mission from the hushed intensity of their parents. The 2 younger Wetzel children, soundly asleep, were shielded by sheer innocence. They reached the clearing, a vast, dew-soaked field surrounded by a dense, black forest. They worked in a desperate silence, the 8 of them a single, coordinated machine. First, the burner was assembled. The huge, double-oil barrel chamber was positioned, the pipes connected, and the 4 propane tanks secured to the steel frame of the gondola. Next, the immense brown canopy was unfolded. It seemed to swallow the entire field. Peter and Gunther, moving with the practiced efficiency of men fighting for their lives, secured the balloon's mouth to the burner ring. The critical moment came. Inflation. Peter threw a switch, and the fan, a powerful, modified industrial blower they had smuggled onto the black market, roared to life, pushing cold air into the limp fabric. The balloon began to stir, slowly rising into a vast, shapeless dome. It took 30 minutes just to fill the balloon with enough cold air to hold its shape. Then, the final terrifying step, the heat. Peter positioned a flare gun, modified to shoot a sustained, lower-temperature pilot flame, and ignited the massive, improvised burner. Whoosh! The sound was overwhelming, a sustained, thunderous roar as 100 gallons of propane a minute began to combust, shooting a 15-foot tongue of fire straight up into the maw of the fabric. The canopy billowed, then slowly, majestically began to swell, taking shape, shedding its limpness for the hard, taut curve of a vessel ready to sail. But as the balloon rose, Peter's heart sank. He noticed 2 things instantly. First, the ascent was sluggish. Second, and far worse, they could feel the heat. Too much of the hot air was escaping. The stitching, the hundreds of hours of desperate, late-night sewing by Peter and Doris, was not airtight. The common cotton bedsheets and thin thread simply couldn't contain the high-pressure thermal lift required for their immense weight. The basket, carrying only the 2 fathers, lifted barely 6 feet off the ground, then settled, bumping back down as the balloon refused to gain any further altitude. "We're too heavy. The lift isn't there." Peter screamed over the roar of the burner. Gunther, equally panicked, pointed to the propane gauges. "We're burning fuel too fast. We only have 20 minutes of lift like this, Peter." They made a snap, devastating decision. The Wetzels, Gunther, Petra, and their 2 children had to stay. The balloon was simply not strong enough to lift 8. They would make a run for it with the Strelzigs first, then return for the Wetzels. It was a lie they told each other to ease the pain of the separation. Gunther quickly helped secure the 4 Strelzigs into the gondola. Peter, with Doris and his two boys, ignited the burner again. The balloon rose a little higher this time, maybe 20 feet, and began to drift horizontally. It was a harrowing, short flight. After 15 minutes, with the propane tanks nearly empty, Peter had to cut the burner. They plunged violently, crashing back into the forest canopy about 500 meters from their launch site. They scrambled out of the deflated balloon, hearts pounding. They had to abandon everything. They pulled off their coats and hats, leaving them behind to confuse any search dogs, and sprinted back to their car, leaving the enormous, deflated brown-striped fabric, the steel gondola, and the 4 propane tanks strewn across the field. The next day, the Stasi found the remnants. The scale of the attempt, the industrial fan, the massive burner, the custom-made parachute they had sewn, the sheer audacity of it, sent immediate shockwaves through the Ministry for State Security. They knew this was not a simple defector. This was a highly motivated, resourceful engineer. The abandoned burner tanks still bore the stamped serial numbers of the supplier in Posnek. A secret police investigation, codenamed Operation Balloon, was immediately launched. The Stasi, led by the ruthless local commander, now had a trail. Peter and Gunter had 20 days, maybe less, before the Stasi traced the tanks back to them. The first attempt had failed, but it had successfully painted a massive, unmissable target on their backs. They couldn't afford a second failure. They needed a new, radically better balloon. The clock had become a ticking bomb. The failure of the first flight on September 17, 1979, was a disaster not just because they were still in the GDR, but because the evidence was now in Stasi hands. For Peter Strelzik and Gunter Wetzel, every minute spent in Posnek was a minute closer to the knock on the door. The Stasi, with the methodical cruelty of a totalitarian regime, didn't just collect the physical evidence. They initiated a massive, yet discreet, manhunt. The secret police dispatched dozens of plainclothes officers to the region, starting with the propane supplier. The serial numbers traced the tanks to a bulk delivery to a local industrial concern, and from there, through layers of bureaucracy and backroom dealings, the net began to close. They were looking for a man, or men, with mechanical skill, access to industrial supplies, and an understanding of physics. Peter, the Air Force veteran and electrician, and Gunter, the bricklayer who moonlighted in electrical work, fit the profile perfectly. Meanwhile, the two families were frantic, forced to maintain an impossible normalcy. Peter went to work every day, feigning ignorance and chatting with his colleagues about mundane party news, his stomach churning with cold fear. Doris and Petra played cards and drank coffee, discussing their children's schoolwork, while secretly cleaning and preparing their homes to look as innocent as possible. The weight of the secret was crushing, especially on the boys, who knew the peril but were forbidden to speak of it. Their immediate problem was the material. The old balloon had failed because of the porous cotton. To lift 8 people, a weight of nearly 1,700 pounds, including the gear and gondola, they needed a lightweight, air-impermeable fabric, nylon taffeta. But nylon, especially in the industrial quantities they needed, was a rarity in East Germany, a material heavily restricted for consumer use. Peter and Gunter realized they needed a staggering 1,400 square yards of it. They launched a desperate 3-day procurement mission across the GDR. They traveled hundreds of kilometers by train and car, hitting every major department store in Jena, Erfurt, and as far afield as Dresden, posing as buyers for a fictitious large-scale camping club. They couldn't buy it all at once. A single large purchase would trigger an automatic report to the Stasi's Economic Intelligence Division. Instead, they bought it in tiny, pathetic increments. Peter would walk into a store, buy 2 yards of tent lining, pay cash, then go back 10 minutes later wearing a different coat and hat, and buy another 2 yards. Doris and Petra did the same. The children were drafted into this subtle criminal enterprise, waiting outside the shops to ferry the small, bundled scraps of fabric out to the car. They bought 32 different shades of nylon, from pastel yellow and bright green to pale blue, all they could find. The plan to dye the fabric brown had to be abandoned. The dye process compromised the nylon's integrity and increased its weight. Their new balloon would be a hideous, brightly colored patchwork quilt, a flying advertisement for their crime, but structurally sound. Back in the attic, the frenzied sewing began again. This time, there was no gentle background noise. There was only the frantic, loud rhythm of the machine, now pushed far past its engineering limits. The nylon was slippery and hard to manage, but it was thinner, stronger, and crucially lighter. Peter had learned from the first failure. He needed to create an overlap seam, a specialized double-stitch technique used in sail-making to ensure no air escaped. This meant the sewing process took twice as long and required even more meticulous care. The strain between the two families began to show. The constant, gnawing fear, the lack of sleep, and the immense danger created a pressure cooker environment. Peter and Gunter, the engineers, argued constantly over the optimal shape. Peter favoring a spherical, more efficient design, Gunter prioritizing the easier-to-sew teardrop shape. Doris and Petra worried about the children, especially the teenage boys, who were old enough to comprehend the likely consequences of their failure. The Wetzels had a smaller window. Gunter was becoming convinced the Stasi was looking for two families, and he wanted out now. A critical moment arrived when Peter heard a snippet of conversation at work. A colleague, an ardent party member, mentioned hearing a rumor, a crazy story, about an abandoned balloon near the border found by the Grenztruppen border troops. The official line was that it was a foreign spy balloon, but the internal conversation in the party ranks was that the perpetrator was local, organized, and must be caught before he tries again. Peter knew the Stasi was closing in. He raced home, his legs pumping with adrenaline. The serial numbers on the propane tanks had been traced to the industrial distributor. The distributor had identified the delivery date. The Stasi was now asking about unusual purchases in the weeks leading up to the failed flight. The clock had moved from weeks to mere days. They had to leave with the first available weather window. They could no longer wait for the perfect conditions. They had to fly under any conditions. September 19th to 27th, 1979. Posnack, East Germany. The house was no longer a home. It was a pressurized, temporary bunker. The sewing machine in the attic ran almost continuously for the next week, the noise now accepted as an unavoidable risk. They had sacrificed perfect camouflage for speed and structural integrity. The new balloon, a monstrous, 85-foot-tall patchwork of 32 different nylon colors, was an engineering masterpiece born of sheer terror. It contained approximately 1,400 square yards of fabric, sewn with over 6,000 feet of high-test polyester thread. Its sheer size was a defiant declaration against the physics that had defeated them the first time. Peter Strelzik, ever the meticulous mechanic, made two crucial modifications to the system. First, the burner. He and Gunter doubled the size of the brass fire extinguisher nozzle, ensuring a far greater volume of propane could be forced through, creating a more powerful, continuous flame. They also redesigned the mixing chamber, using a salvaged, larger steel drum to better contain and direct the heat into the nylon envelope. This new burner was terrifyingly effective, sounding less like a whoosh and more like the sustained roar of a jet engine, a sound they could only tolerate for brief test bursts in Gunter's soundproof garage before quickly shutting it down. Second, the gondola. Realizing the steel frame was too rigid and heavy for a rough landing, Gunter quickly fabricated a new, slightly larger basket using thin, lightweight, corrugated metal sheeting for the base and sides, held together by aluminum struts. They lined the floor with thick pieces of foam and blankets for the children. This new basket was their sanctuary, designed not for comfort, but for survival. The most stressful element, however, was the final waterproofing. The first balloon lost air through its seams. For the new balloon, Doris and Petra undertook the excruciating task of painting the entire network of seams with a rubber sealing compound. This sticky, chemical-smelling substance was meant for repairing fishing waders and was bought in tiny, expensive tubes from multiple fishing supply stores. They worked in the attic, the rubber fumes making them dizzy, painting inch by inch, sealing every single double-stitched overlap. The smell, acrid and unavoidable, now permeated the house. Peter's sons, Frank and Andreas, were tasked with opening and closing the attic window at precise intervals to air the space, a small task that made them feel like active participants in the mission. By September 27th, the massive, multicolored envelope was complete, folded into a dense, heavy block, and covered in the center of the attic. The systems were ready. The families were ready. All that remained was the weather. Peter began monitoring the West German weather forecast, a daily, clandestine ritual performed under the cover of a static-laden East German news broadcast on the family's illegal shortwave radio. They needed two things: absolute darkness. A new moon had just passed, but the later the hour, the better, and a gentle wind blowing west. A strong wind would tear the fragile nylon or push them parallel to the wall, where they would be easy targets for searchlights and machine guns. A wind from the east was the only way out. The forecasts were frustratingly inconsistent. Low-pressure systems kept bringing wind from the south or north. Days bled into nights, and the tension was a physical pain. Then, on the evening of September 29, 1979, the radio crackled with a promising report from a West German weather station near Hof. A slow-moving cold front from the east is expected to pass overnight, bringing a low-speed, consistent easterly breeze across the border regions of Thuringia, followed by heavy fog. Fog was the perfect tactical advantage. It would reduce the visibility of the border troops, mask the glow of the massive burner flame, and obscure the sight of a brightly colored, 85-foot-tall balloon. Peter and Gunter exchanged a look across the dinner table, a look of exhausted, desperate finality. It was tonight. The plan for the launch site had to be meticulously updated. They couldn't go back to the first site near Oberlemnitz. It would be under Stasi surveillance. Gunter had scouted a new location, a small, isolated meadow near the town of Tannbach, approximately 30 miles from Posneck. Tannbach was famously split by the border, its inhabitants living in the literal shadow of the inner German fence, a symbolically potent and tactically sound location for their escape. They made their final preparations. The children were given sleeping pills mixed into their cocoa to ensure they remained quiet during the tense drive and inflation. The families packed nothing but their ID cards, essential documents, and a small quantity of East German marks, worthless in the West, but a habit of the controlled economy. They left behind every memory, every possession, every anchor to their lives in the GDR. At 9 p.m., Peter went to the attic. He stared at the massive, folded fabric, now their only hope. He whispered two words to his wife, who stood pale but resolute beside him. Let's fly. September 29th, 1979. Posneck to Tannbach, 9:30 p.m. The operation began with an agonizing, silent disassembly. Moving the gigantic, 85-foot-tall nylon envelope from the attic of the Strelzig home was a logistical nightmare. The fabric, once folded, weighed over 300 pounds and was bulky beyond belief. Peter and Gunter, straining in the dim light of a single bulb wrapped in a dark cloth, hauled it down the narrow, creaking wooden staircase. Every thump and scrape echoed in the deathly quiet house. They had to dislocate the attic door from its hinges to squeeze the bundle through. Doris and Petra stood guard below, listening for the slightest sounds from the street. A passing car, a neighbor's light coming on, the distinct, ominous whine of a Stasi Trabant patrol car. Once downstairs, the fabric was jammed into the trunk of Peter's old Wartburg 353, along with the carefully packed new basket and the industrial fan. The 4 propane cylinders, secured with rope and blankets, were strapped into Gunter's car. They looked like two families going on a very poorly planned, extremely heavy camping trip. A cover story they knew wouldn't hold up for 5 minutes if they were stopped. The children, drugged into a deep, heavy sleep, were bundled up and placed in the back seats, oblivious to the fact that they were lying on top of the only means of salvation. For Doris and Petra, seeing their children so completely vulnerable was perhaps the hardest part. The risk of suffocation or injury in a car crash, let alone a catastrophic balloon failure, was constantly on their minds. At 10:15 p.m., the two cars, blacked out except for their dim parking lights, pulled away from the Strelzik house. The drive from Posneck to Tanbach was about 30 miles, a distance Peter knew intimately. But tonight, every kilometer stretched into an eternity. He drove slowly, rigidly adhering to every traffic law, terrified that a minor infraction, a rolling stop, a dim headlight, would invite the scrutiny of the Volkspolizei, People's Police, who had been quietly alerted to look for suspicious movements of large, unknown loads in the district. The route took them dangerously close to known Stasi checkpoints. At one point, just outside a small village, they saw the reflection of a blue light in the distance. Peter's heart hammered against his ribs. He instinctively pulled over into a small, tree-lined pull-off, killing the engine and the lights. Gunter did the same behind him. They sat in absolute silence for 5 minutes, the only sound the faint, nervous breathing of the adults and the deeper, drugged breaths of the children. The blue light passed, a maintenance vehicle, not a patrol. Peter pulled back onto the road, his hands slick with sweat, his jaw aching from being clenched so tight. Their destination, the meadow near Tanbach, was chosen for its seclusion and its proximity to the border. Tanbach was a historically significant location. The village was literally bisected by the Iron Curtain. To the east was the GDR, to the west Bavaria. The inner German border here was a formidable series of anti-vehicle trenches, watchtowers, electrified fences, and the notorious Death Strip, patrolled by heavily armed Grenztruppen. They arrived at the launch site just after 11:30 p.m. The meadow was perfect, a flat, open space surrounded by a dense screen of tall pines, which offered some protection from the wind and obscured them from distant view. Crucially, the forecast fog had begun to roll in, a thick, swirling gray mist that clung close to the ground, swallowing sound and light. Visibility was reduced to 50 feet. Unloading was immediate and urgent. The four adults moved with a practiced, desperate speed. Peter and Gunter focused on the burner system and the logistics of the fabric. They spread out the immense nylon envelope in a giant circle. The multicolored patchwork was barely visible in the heavy fog, which was a blessing. The first critical failure point, the industrial fan. As Peter powered up the fan to begin the cold air inflation, the motor whined and then stalled. It was a mechanical failure induced by the immense strain and continuous use over the last weeks. Peter cursed silently. There was no time to fix it. Without the fan, it would take hours for the wind alone to inflate the 85-foot envelope. Hours they didn't have. In a flash of desperate inspiration, Peter grabbed a modified hairdryer and attached a large, flexible ventilation hose he had brought as an auxiliary part. He aimed the weak stream of hot air from the dryer into the mouth of the balloon, a tiny breath trying to fill a giant lung. It was hopeless. Gunter, watching the fuel gauge and the time, saw the plan collapsing. "Peter, we have to use the burner for cold inflation," he yelled, knowing the risk. Cold inflation with a hot air balloon burner is a hazardous maneuver. They had to fire the massive, jet engine-like burner in short, controlled bursts, creating brief waves of heat to lift the mouth of the balloon off the ground, then quickly shutting it off, hoping the air mass they'd captured wouldn't collapse. It was a waste of precious propane, but it was their only option. Whoosh! The terrifying roar of the burner echoed across the foggy meadow. They held the flame for 5 seconds, then shut it down. The top of the nylon canopy lifted a few feet, allowing the adults to crawl underneath and physically lift the fabric by hand, pulling it upwards like raising a giant floppy tent, hoping to catch the subtle easterly breeze. After 45 minutes of frantic, back-breaking, silent work, pulling, lifting, and firing the burner in short, heart-stopping bursts, the balloon finally stood, a majestic, shimmering, unstable tower of fabric, its bright colors muted by the fog. It was time to get the families inside. The point of no return had arrived. September 29th, 1979. Tanbach Meadow, 12:20 a.m. The last, most critical phase had begun. Peter and Gunter rushed back to the two cars. Doris and Petra were already rousing the 4 children from their heavy, induced sleep, their movements gentle but brutally urgent. The kids were dazed, confused, and shivering in the damp, foggy air. The four small bodies, Frank, 15, Andreas, 11, and the two young Wetzel children, were quickly bundled into the corrugated metal gondola. The atmosphere around the basket was a hurricane of sensory overload. The fog amplified the massive, deafening roar of the burner as Peter pulled the trigger, igniting a sustained column of fire. The flame, a towering, angry beacon of orange and blue, shot 15 feet into the sky, its heat intense enough to be felt 50 feet away. The fog glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, making the entire scene look like some strange, industrial ritual. "In! Now!" Peter screamed over the noise, his voice raw. Doris, Gunter, and Petra scrambled into the small, 4-foot square basket. They were jammed shoulder to shoulder, 8 people in a precarious metal cage, suspended beneath 1,400 square yards of nylon and a terrifying plume of fire. The 4 propane tanks, strapped to the sides, seemed dangerously close to the intense heat. Peter positioned himself at the center, his hand on the burner control valve, a simple, custom-made lever that controlled their life and death. He held a high-powered pair of West German binoculars he had kept hidden for years, his only means of navigation. Gunter was his co-pilot, responsible for monitoring the propane gauges and the height. "Pressure holding. Give it full heat, Peter!" Gunter yelled, his eyes wide. Peter pushed the lever, and the burner unleashed a sound that seemed to peel the skin off their faces. The massive nylon canopy, now fully inflated with blazing hot air, shuddered violently. Then, with a slow, agonizing heave, the gondola lifted off the damp meadow floor. Lift off, 12:31 a.m. The moment they left the ground, the fear transformed into a new kind of terror, the terror of ascent. They began to rise rapidly, the burner roaring continuously. The ground, shrouded in the thick fog, disappeared almost instantly. In their eagerness to gain altitude quickly and clear the border obstacles, Peter burned propane at maximum capacity. Peter kept the burner engaged. Their rate of ascent was alarming, but necessary. They had to clear the 50-foot watchtowers and the effective range of the GDR border guards, KPV heavy machine guns. "We are up, Peter. We are moving. West," Gunter shouted, pointing to a small, flickering light on the horizon, the faint glow of a West German town, their target. At approximately 300 feet, they broke through the dense fog layer. The sight that greeted them was horrifyingly beautiful. Below them, the entire landscape was a seamless, swirling blanket of white fog, completely obscuring the land, the roads, and crucially, the border guards. Above, the sky was a clear, cold, inky black, scattered with indifferent, brilliant stars. But this beautiful view also presented their first technical crisis. The nylon fabric, which had felt so strong on the ground, began to stretch under the atmospheric pressure and heat. They were ascending too quickly, and the internal pressure was straining the seams. Then they heard a new sound, not the burner, but a loud, continuous rip. The top, Doris screamed, pointing upward. A long, 4-foot tear had opened near the apex of the balloon, a seam that had failed under the extreme stress. Hot air, their only source of lift, was hemorrhaging into the night sky. "Gunter, hold the kids. Doris, try to tie it off." Peter yelled. The tear meant they were bleeding altitude. Peter had to make a choice. Either reduce the flame and fall back into the fog, risking capture, or increase the flame and risk tearing the balloon further and using up the last of their fuel. He chose the latter, gambling on distance over structural integrity. He pushed the burner to its absolute limit, the roar becoming a continuous, deafening wall of sound. The basket swung violently under the sudden surge of power. They checked their altimeter, a crudely modified barometer Peter had stolen from a factory lab. It read 6,000 feet. They were high enough to be safe from small arms fire, but they were now adrift in the strong currents of the upper atmosphere, moving too fast and losing precious lift. Suddenly, Peter heard a strange, rhythmic clicking sound coming from above the fog, followed by a faint, heavy thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of an East German border guard helicopter, a Me-2, sent up to patrol the border, drawn by the sound of the enormous, nonstop burner. The Stasi had been quick. The fog had helped them escape the ground, but the noise was betraying them in the air. Peter threw the lever to cut the burner. Silence. The helicopter, unable to see them above the fog, continued its rhythmic patrol below, searching for the source of the heat and noise. The Strelziks and Wetzels hung in the cold, silent sky, adrift, praying the helicopter would not break through the cloud layer. They were now dropping rapidly, the cold air rushing past the rip in the nylon. Their flight had turned into a terrifying, silent free fall toward the unknown. September 30th, 1979. Above the inner German border. 12:40 a.m. The silence was deafening, broken only by the thin, high whistle of the wind rushing past the massive rip near the apex of the balloon. The descent was rapid and terrifying. Peter Strelzik watched the modified barometer, his single source of truth, spinning backward toward zero. They were losing altitude at an alarming rate. 6,000 feet, 5,000 feet for 1,500 feet. The cold air, pouring in through the 4-foot tear, was destroying the thermal integrity of the envelope. The air in the basket was thick with fear. The children, jarred awake by the sudden lurching and the icy cold, began to cry. Frank and Andreas, the older boys, recognized the danger and were silently clinging to the ropes. The 4 adults worked in frantic, whispered bursts. Doris and Petra, bracing against the sides of the swaying gondola, desperately tried to comfort the younger children, shielding them from the reality of their freefall. Gunter, ever the pragmatist, pointed to the ground, which was still invisible beneath the dense blanket of fog. "We have to reignite, Peter. We'll hit the ground. We don't know if we've crossed yet." But Peter hesitated. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the border guard helicopter was still audible, a menacing heartbeat somewhere in the white void below. Igniting the burner would create a spectacular, enormous flash of light, turning them into an unmissable target for the pilot, who would then direct ground troops straight to their landing spot, whether it was east or west. They dropped into the fog layer again. Suddenly, they were enveloped in the swirling gray moisture, visibility instantly reduced to zero. The descent slowed marginally as they hit the dense, damp air, but the danger intensified. They were now blind, drifting horizontally, completely dependent on the unseen wind current, and they had no idea if they were over the infamous Death Strip. The Death Strip, the no-man's land between the two borders, was layered with landmines, booby traps, and self-firing guns, the SM-70 automatic firing devices. Landing there meant instant, indiscriminate death, regardless of the fog. Peter, realizing their catastrophic loss of altitude, made the terrifying decision to risk the burner. "We need altitude. Gunter, hold tight." He threw the lever. Whoosh! The flame erupted with a violent, deafening roar, a towering column of fire that momentarily illuminated the fog, turning the inside of the balloon's envelope into a blinding, multicolored cave. It was a brief, spectacular display that might have been visible for miles. The helicopter's sound immediately grew louder, closer. The pilot had heard and was now actively moving towards the sound. The burner had the desired effect. The balloon surged upwards, gaining several hundred feet of vital altitude before Peter cut the flame again, plunging them back into silence and darkness. "We have to lose the helicopter," Peter whispered, his voice hoarse. "We need to get higher, find a faster current." He pulled a sack from beneath the seat, the ballast. To gain a desperate burst of altitude without using more fuel, they had brought sacks of fine sand. This was their last, most desperate resource. Peter and Gunter, without speaking, began heaving the heavy sandbags over the side of the gondola. 1 sack, 2 sacks. The combined weight loss was about 60 pounds. The balloon responded, rising slightly. The rising sensation was slow, a subtle compensation for the lost mass, but it was enough to catch a slightly higher, faster current. The faint, intermittent sound of the helicopter began to recede behind them. They were moving, and they were moving fast, but they were still completely blind. Peter couldn't use his binoculars in the fog. The beam of a flashlight would be visible through the mist. He had to rely on sheer intuition and the compass Gunter was holding, which was spinning wildly with the motion of the balloon. "The wind is still east to west, Peter. We're going over," Gunter stated, his voice ringing with a fragile hope. Then, at approximately 3,500 feet, they heard a new sound, one that cut through the silence of the night, a series of sharp cracks, followed by the distinct whiz-thump of bullets hitting the balloon. They had been spotted by ground patrol. The Grenztruppen, unable to see the balloon, had heard the sound of the burner and, moments later, the dropping sandbags. Realizing the balloon was above them, the border guards were now firing blind volleys into the fog. The cotton lining they had added to the new nylon envelope saved them. The fabric was thick enough to absorb the impact of the initial rounds, which were likely from lower-caliber rifles. But the hits were real. Peter had to act instantly. "Burner. Now. Max heat." He threw the valve. The massive column of fire roared back to life, the noise and the light a defiant gesture against the incoming fire. The bullet impacts stopped as they surged rapidly upward, leaving the range of the ground troops. They continued to climb until the barometer read 8,200 feet. The temperature outside, the gondola plummeted to near freezing. The 8 occupants, dressed only in thin clothes and huddled together, were bitterly cold. The tear in the nylon was leaking air faster than ever, and Peter knew he couldn't sustain this altitude for long. The propane gauge was plunging toward the empty mark. They were high, they were fast, but they were almost out of fuel. The next decision would be their last. September 30th, 1979. Above the German border region. 1 a.m. At 8,200 feet, the cold was paralyzing, seeping into the marrow of the 8 people crammed into the metal cage. The children had stopped crying, now huddled in a state of hypothermic shock, their lips blue. The tear in the nylon, now freezing slightly at the edges, was a continuous, icy exhaust port. The rapid speed of their horizontal drift was all that kept the balloon aloft, but it meant they were traversing an immense, unknown distance with no control. Peter Strelzik knew he was playing a game of chicken with his fuel and the atmosphere. If he kept the burner going to maintain altitude, they would run out of fuel while still high, leading to a catastrophic, uncontrollable freefall. If he let the burner die, they would drop rapidly, likely crashing into the mountains or the heavily fortified border region before they crossed. He chose the middle path, intermittent bursts. He would fire the burner for precisely 5 seconds, allowing the flame to surge upward and reheat the envelope, then immediately cut it, relying on the brief thermal boost to stretch their glide. Each roar of the burner was a terrifying reminder of their finite resource. "Fuel is critical, Peter," Gunter whispered, his teeth chattering, pointing a stiff, gloved finger at the near-empty propane gauges. Maybe 5 minutes left of continuous burn. 5 minutes of fuel to cover an unknown distance. Peter grabbed his binoculars, peering down through the last vestiges of the lower fog layer. At this altitude, he could finally see something recognizable. Lights. Not the scattered, yellowish, strictly controlled lighting of the east, but a constellation of bright, densely packed, varied colored lights, a city grid, street lamps, the reckless glow of a consumer society. They were looking at West Germany. The sight hit them with a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief and renewed panic. They had done it. They had crossed, but they were still over a mile high, plummeting silently toward the lights and out of fuel. "We are over the west, Gunter. Prepare for descent," Peter announced, his voice cracking with emotion. He threw the burner lever one last time, a desperate 3-second blast to push them forward just a few more meters, away from the immediate border zone and its potential complications. Then, the final metallic click. The propane tanks were empty. The burner was silent. The huge, 85-foot nylon envelope, no longer supported by heat, began to collapse inward, shriveling like a leaf. The balloon transformed from an engine of flight into a clumsy, gigantic parachute. Their controlled glide turned into a rapid, brutal plunge. The speed was now alarming. The corrugated metal gondola swayed wildly beneath the fabric, whipping them back and forth in a terrifying arc. Peter and Gunter, fighting to maintain their footing, braced the women and children. "Hold on. Everyone brace. We're coming down hard," Peter yelled. He was focused on one thing, a small, dark patch of forest visible through his binoculars, a place that might offer some cushion to the impact. He ripped at the cords, holding a final, small sandbag ballast, their last attempt at stabilizing the descent. The cord broke, and the last weight was gone. The descent. The final 6,000 feet were a blur of sound and motion. The wind roared past them. The nylon envelope, fighting its own collapse, made strange, tearing sounds. The smell of burning rubber and ozone filled the cold air. Suddenly, Peter heard a series of heavy, distinct snaps and cracks. They had hit the tops of the trees. The giant patchwork balloon, catching the thick upper branches of a pine forest, snagged and slowed, the massive canvas tearing itself to pieces on the needles and bark. The force of the snagging arrest was violent, throwing the occupants against the sides of the gondola. The gondola dropped the last 40 feet like a stone, tearing through smaller branches before slamming into the forest floor with a crushing impact. The thin, corrugated metal frame buckled and twisted, the propane tanks ripping free and clattering away, thankfully silent and empty. The occupants were thrown onto the floor, bruised and stunned, but miraculously alive. For a full minute, there was absolute, ringing silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the adults and the whimpering of the children. They were alive. They had survived the impossible. Peter, the first to move, crawled out of the wreckage. He was covered in scratches and dust, his entire body aching, but his mind was racing. They were on the ground, but were they safe? Had the border guards tracked their descent? He looked up through the shredded nylon hanging from the trees. He couldn't see anything. He pulled Gunner from the wreckage. "We need to move. Now, we have to hide the evidence." They began the frantic final act, destroying the remnants of their crime. They couldn't burn the nylon. The smoke would attract attention. Instead, they took the knives they had brought and began furiously hacking apart the crumpled envelope, cutting it into unrecognizable scraps, burying the pieces under pine needles and dirt. They smashed the remaining electronic components, including the stolen barometer, and scattered the pieces. They had about 20 minutes before dawn, and every second mattered. September 30th, 1979. A pine forest near Nyla, West Germany. 1:30 a.m. The cold, damp earth beneath Peter Strelzik's hands felt strangely, wonderfully solid. His entire world had been confined to the small, swaying space of the metal gondola for an eternity, and now, the freedom of the forest floor, though still terrifying, was a palpable relief. He and Gunter worked with the frantic energy of men escaping a burning building. They were hacking at the tangled, shredded nylon, using their small hunting knives to cut the massive canvas into manageable pieces, which they then furiously kicked and buried beneath the pine needles and damp leaf litter. Doris and Petra, bruised and shaken but fundamentally unharmed, moved the 4 children, who were now fully awake and deeply confused, deeper into the shadows of the forest. The younger children were crying softly, asking where they were and why they were hiding. The parents could only whisper one word: quiet. The absolute priority was to create a void, to ensure that if the border guards from the east had tracked their descent, they would find no immediate, conclusive evidence of a large-scale escape. The massive, colorful parachute was their biggest liability. They worked for 20 minutes, turning the scene of the crash into a scattering of debris, hoping the darkness and fog would conceal the rest. As the first faint gray light of dawn began to leak through the eastern canopy, Peter called a halt. They were exhausted, physically spent, their lungs burning, their hands raw. "We have to move," Peter gasped, pulling Doris toward him. "We walk west. We have to find a village, a road, anything to prove we made it." They struck out blindly through the thick pine woods, moving as fast as the terrain and the children would allow. Every snapping twig, Every rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through their bodies. They were listening for the sounds of the east, the roar of a jeep, the barking of search dogs, the shout of a patrol. After 30 minutes of agonizing, uphill travel through dense underbrush, they broke through the tree line and came to a narrow, paved road. It was deserted and silent. Peter approached the road cautiously, his heart pounding in his ears. He was looking for signs, not just any signs, but West German signs. The architecture, the road paint, the colors, everything was subtly but significantly different between the two Germanys. He knelt by the side of the road and ran his hand over the pavement. Nothing. He then noticed a small, metal traffic sign leaning against a tree, marking a junction. He stood up, wiping the pine needles from his eyes, and stared. The text on the sign was printed in the official DIN 1451 font used in the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. The colors were slightly brighter. The pole was galvanized steel, not the cheaper, painted metal of the GDR. And the name? Nyla, a small market town in Bavaria. He turned and looked back at his family, his face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and profound, shattering relief. "We made it," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "We're in the West." Gunter, the pragmatic bricklayer, needed tangible proof. He walked over to a nearby garbage can, the kind used by the Bundespost, West German post office. He reached in and pulled out a discarded newspaper. He held it up in the dim light. The headline, the typeface, the ad for Western cars and consumer goods. It was unequivocally Free German Press. The date was September 30th, 1979. The 8 of them sank to their knees right there on the side of the West German road, weeping silently. The culmination of 2 years of clandestine planning, 2 terrifying launch attempts, and a near-fatal plunge from 2 miles high. They had traded all their earthly possessions for one newspaper headline and the freedom to read it. Their relief was quickly replaced by a new, confusing vulnerability. They were strangers in a foreign land. They were East German citizens, now undocumented foreigners with no money, no identity beyond their GDR passports, and a terrifying story to tell. They knew they needed to alert the authorities, but the ingrained fear of any police authority, Eastern or Western, was hard to shake. Peter saw a small farmhouse in the distance, maybe a quarter of a mile down the road. They began walking toward it, a bedraggled, exhausted procession of 8 people emerging from the foggy woods. As they approached the house, the sound of a motorcycle broke the silence. A young man, wearing a helmet and leather jacket, slowed down, noticing the group emerging from the woods. He stopped his bike, pulling off his helmet, and stared at the 8 people, 4 adults for bewildered children covered in dirt, pine needles, and the distinct, vivid scraps of multicolored nylon still clinging to their clothes. "Good morning," the young man said, a slight, curious smile on his face. "Are you folks all right? You look like you've had a rough night." It was a simple, innocuous greeting, but to Peter, it was the first human voice of freedom he had heard, a sound that carried no threat of arrest, no accusation of treason. Peter stepped forward, his body swaying with exhaustion, and managed to say the words he had dreamed of for years. "We need help. We just flew over from a GDR." The young motorcyclist, a 22-year-old named Helmut, stared at the group in stunned silence. He took in the wild, terrified eyes, the clothes covered in pine sap and dirt, and the colorful, jagged scraps of nylon still clinging to Peter's jacket. He noticed the heavy, unfamiliar accent and the complete lack of luggage. In this border region, tales of daring escapes were legendary, but seeing the survivors emerge from the mist-shrouded woods was something else entirely. Helmut recovered quickly. He was a local, familiar with the high tension of the inner German border, and he recognized the look of people who had just passed through a crucible. "The GDR? You flew? A balloon?" he asked, his voice low with disbelief and awe. Peter simply nodded, unable to speak further. Helmut immediately went into action. He knew the protocol was to contact the Bayerische Grenzpolizei, Bavarian Border Police, immediately, but first, the families needed warmth and food. He sped down to the nearby farmhouse they had been walking toward. Within minutes, The farmer, his wife, and their children were outside, looking with utter astonishment at the group. The Strelzics and Wetzels were led into the warm farmhouse kitchen, a room that smelled of fresh coffee, with smoke and baked bread, a potent, visceral aroma of freedom compared to the synthetic smells of the GDR. The farmer's wife immediately began heating milk and laying out a spread of food: fresh rolls, butter, cheese, and jam, a display of abundance that left the East Germans speechless. The children, exhausted and no longer confined by their terror, ate ravenously. For Peter and Gunther, the first sip of West German coffee was a moment of dizzying, emotional release. They were safe, but the bureaucracy of freedom was about to begin. At 8:15 a.m., the first official vehicle arrived, a dark green Mercedes-Benz carrying 2 officers of the Bavarian Border Police. The sight of uniforms, even Western ones, triggered a deep, instinctual panic in the families. Doris clutched Andreas tightly, and Peter instinctively moved to shield his family. The lead officer, a calm, middle-aged man with a reassuringly gentle demeanor, stepped out. He spoke to them in a soft, non-threatening tone. "Good morning. My name is Chief Inspector Kruger. You are safe. You are in the Federal Republic of Germany. We are here to help you." Peter, using a shaky voice, recounted the details of their impossible flight. The 2 years of planning, the failed first attempt, the frantic sewing of the nylon patchwork, the midnight drive to Tanbach, the climb to over 8,000 feet, and the final, brutal crash landing. He pulled the last, flimsy piece of evidence from his pocket, a tattered, crumpled map of the GDR he had used to try and plot their route. The police were both skeptical and amazed. They had dealt with hundreds of Republic Fluchtling, Republic flyers. Over the years, people swimming, hiding in cars, or scaling fences, but a homemade hot air balloon carrying 2 entire families was unprecedented. Kruger dispatched a team to the crash site to verify the story. The police team quickly located the wreckage. They found the massive, ripped nylon remnants tangled in the trees, the bent and twisted metal gondola, and the empty propane tanks. The sight of the scale and audacity of the homemade construction instantly confirmed the story. The flight was not only real, it was an unprecedented engineering feat of desperation. Back at the station in Nyla, the families were officially processed as political refugees. They were given clean clothing, a medical checkup, and for the first time in their lives, genuine Western identification papers. The interrogation was long, but courteous. The police needed to ensure they were not Stasi plants or spies, a common fear in the border regions. The sheer, raw authenticity of their story, coupled with the detailed physical evidence from the crash site, quickly satisfied the investigators. The news of the escape was too sensational to contain. A border police officer, recognizing the historical significance of the event, made an anonymous call to the West German Press Agency, DPA, in nearby Hof. By midday, the small, quiet town of Nyla was transformed. It was immediately swarming with journalists from every major West German newspaper, radio station, and television network. The story, 8 persons flee GDR in homemade hot air balloon, was already being printed on special edition papers. The Strelzik and Wetzel families, the anonymous people from the East just hours before, were now the face of resistance against the Iron Curtain. The West German media immediately dubbed their flight the Great Balloon Escape or the Impossible Flight. The families, now given temporary housing in a refugee processing center, watched themselves on television. The grainy, helicopter footage of the massive, multicolored nylon wreck tangled in the Bavarian pines was broadcast across the world. For the first time since their terrifying escape, they allowed themselves to process the immense weight of what they had done. They were free, but the danger was not yet over. Back in the East, the furious wheels of the Stasi had already begun to turn, determined to erase the memory of their success and punish those who remained. October 1st, 1979. East Germany, Ministry for State Security Headquarters, Berlin. The news of the successful balloon escape, confirmed by the sensational coverage on West German television and radio, sent a shockwave of cold fury through the upper ranks of the Staatssicherheit, Stasi. Minister Erich Mielke himself was reportedly incandescent. The successful flight of 8 people, carried by a makeshift device constructed from bedsheets and tarp, was not merely a security breach. It was a profound, globally broadcast humiliation for the German Democratic Republic. It made a mockery of the inner German border's fortified invincibility. The Stasi's response was immediate, brutal, and characteristic of their operational methodology. Operation Balloon was escalated from a localized manhunt to a high-priority, nationwide security cleanup. The objective was twofold. First, to absolutely ensure that no one else could replicate the flight, and second, to exact punitive justice on anyone connected to the families who remained in the GDR. The Stasi's investigation focused heavily on the physical evidence found at the first failed launch site near Oberlemnitz and the remaining debris from the successful crash site. They quickly pieced together the identity of the perpetrators. Peter Strelzik's job as an electrician and mechanic, his former military background, and Gunter Wetzel's specialized welding and electrical skills now became the critical data points. Within 48 hours, the Stasi were at the family's empty homes in Posneck. They swept the residences clean, taking every document, every scrap of paper, and every tool. The sewing machine used to stitch the immense canopy was seized and analyzed for evidence of the fabric used. Every neighbor, colleague, and acquaintance of both families was brought in for grueling, intimidating interrogation sessions, sometimes lasting 20 hours, aimed at discovering who had assisted or known about the plot. The primary target of the Stasi's retaliatory fury became the remaining family members. Doris Strelzik's sister, her parents, and Gunter Wetzel's elderly mother were all placed under immediate, intense surveillance observation. Their phones were bugged, their mail intercepted, and they were forbidden from communicating with their now-defected relatives in the West. This was a common tactic used by the Stasi, creating a network of collateral human hostages to put pressure on the defectors and deter future escape attempts. Crucially, the Stasi issued a directive to immediately confiscate and scrutinize all sales record for large quantities of specific materials: nylon, polyester thread, tin canvas, propane tanks, and specific types of industrial fans. This led to an immediate, unofficial black market in all these items, as people feared they would be linked to the balloon spies. More broadly, the success of the escape necessitated a new layer of security to prevent copycat attempts. The Stasi began an internal research program into thermal signatures, how to spot the telltale heat plume of a hot air balloon burner against the cold night sky. The East German border guards were ordered to increase helicopter patrols and train searchlight operators to specifically look for large, slow-moving objects in the upper atmosphere. The lesson of the Strelzik-Wetzel flight was that the air above the wall was now a viable escape route. October 1979, the West German aftermath. The Strelzik and Wetzel families, safe in Bavaria, were now international celebrities. They were invited onto major Western news programs, their tale of ingenuity and courage becoming a powerful propaganda tool against the GDR regime. They were given substantial financial support by the West German government, and private donations poured in from citizens moved by their story. Their story had a lasting impact. Gunter Wetzel and Peter Strelzik had become close friends through their shared ordeal, but the intense, high-pressure, and highly traumatic experience of the escape ultimately proved too much for the two families to remain intertwined in their new life. They decided to settle in different parts of Bavaria, the families amicably parting ways to build their own futures in freedom. Peter Strelzik, the architect of the flight, moved with his family to Nyla, the town where they had landed. He opened an electrical engineering business, finally utilizing his skills without the suffocating bureaucracy of the GDR. The children were able to grow up in a free society, attending Western schools. Gunter Wetzel and his family settled in a different region, also finding stability and work. The Stasi's initial fury never fully subsided. Even years later, the files from Operation Balloon remained classified and highly sensitive. The escape became a legendary footnote in the history of the Cold War, a testament to the fact that no wall, no guard, and no amount of political oppression could completely extinguish the human desire for freedom. The actual ruined balloon, the 85-foot multicolored patchwork of desperation, was eventually recovered and preserved. It stands today, a monumental relic of defiance, at the Haus der Bayerischen Geschichte, Museum of Bavarian History, a silent, colorful monument to the two families who risked everything on a stitch and a flame and achieved the impossible flight over the Berlin Wall. The family's final act of defiance was complete. They were no longer subjects of the GDR, but citizens of the world, defined not by the walls that sought to contain them, but by the courage that allowed them to fly over them.